What's up guys, I'm Chirag and welcome to part 17 of the tutorial series on Python basics tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to cover the exception handling in Python. So basically to handle an exception, try, except, blocked can be used in Python. As you can see on my screen, the very first statement, right? So that is something we can use to handle the exception. So basically try block will assess the code for errors, and if any error is found, then the except block will handle the same, right? So ideally what happens when the error occurs? So basically the program throws an error and it crashed, right? So to handle such a situation and continue the flow, we can have exception handling in place, right? So we don't want the program to crash, but that error should be handled and the rest of the flow or the rest of the execution of the code should go on. So that's where we can use exception handling, right? So let's get started. So here in this tutorial, we are going to cover these many things, that is try, except, then raising an exception. Here we have a spelling mistake. Then we are going to see try and multiple except block, then try except with else block and the finally block, right? So we will start with the very first one. So let's say if I say 10 divided by 0, right? So let's say I want to print 10 divided by 0 and then I want to print hello, right? So let's go ahead and run this. So I will say Python 3 exception underscore p17.py. And as you can see, here we have the exception or the error saying 0 division error division by 0, and it didn't print the hello statement, right? Because the program crashes on line number 9. So how can we handle this? So we can say something like this, that is try, and we will put this block or the block of code within try and then followed by except colon, and we can say print error, and finally we can say print hello. Right, now let's go ahead and run this. So as you can see, it threw an error. So here we had an error at line number 10, but it was handled by the except block that is on line number 11. And then it printed error and then followed by the print statement on line number 14, that is hello, right? So that's how it will handle the exception part, right? So whenever we have an error, the exception block will handle that case and continue the execution. So now let's say we also want to print or log the exception that occurred, right? So when we ran this program for the very first time, then we had an error saying 0 division error. Now we want to print that too, and we also want the program to continue even there is an exception or an error, right? So in that case, we can perform a small modification in this try catch block. So here we can say except exception as E, right? And here instead of print error, we can say print E, right? So this will basically print the exception that is being raised. So now let's go ahead and run this again. So as you can see, here we have the exception or the error saying division by 0, right? And then finally the print statement on line number 14. So this is how you can log or print the exception that is occurred, right? So basically this is the keyword, this is the built-in exception, and this is the general exception which will work for all the cases, right? So this is basically the generalized exception. So apart from this general exception, we also have built-in other exceptions, right? Like value error, type error, or 0 division error. So instead of mentioning the general exception, we can also say 0 division error. Now whenever this exception will be raised, it will execute this part, right? So let's go ahead and run this. So as you can see, it printed division by 0. But if I go ahead and modify this and if I say type error, then it will not handle this. As you can see, it crashes at line number 10, right? Because we are not handling the 0 division error. So either we can go ahead and explicitly define 0 division error as an exception, or we can use exception as E, which is basically the general exception which will handle all the cases, right? So you need to explicitly mention that, or you can simply say exception, right? So there are many built-in exceptions, so you can just have a look from the documentation, right? So now what's happening here is that the exception is raised automatically, right? But what if we want to raise the exception manually? So for that, we can use raise keyword followed by the exception. So at this point of time, the value of E is kind of predefined and coming from the predefined statements. Now what if we want to raise or print the custom message, right? So let's see how we can do that. So let me comment this first. Now let me define a list saying x equal to 1, 2, 3. Now I am defining a for loop saying for I in x, I will put a try except block over here saying try if I double equal to 2, then raise an exception saying raise value error saying this is invalid value, right? So this is just an example. This condition can be anything. And after that, I will say print I followed by the except block saying value error as E colon print E, right? Now let's go ahead and run this. So now as you can see, it printed 1, and then on line number 20 we have the condition if I double equal to 2, so it became true and it raised the value error saying this is invalid value, and this is the same statement or this is the same message that we want to raise, and that has been logged and printed, right? And then finally we had the third loop in which the value of I is 3. So the condition on line number 20 evaluates to false and it printed the rest of the elements, right? So that's how you can manually raise the exception, right? So that was about raising an exception. Now if we want to handle the exception specifically instead of a generic except block, so as I mentioned here, we are using the generic exception, that is exception keyword as E, right? And if we want to define multiple except block which will handle multiple exception rather than the generalized one, so how we can do that? So this is going to be basically the line number 4, that is try block with multiple except block, right? So let's have a look. Again, we will consider this example, that is x equal to 1, 2, 3, and we will modify this try block saying if I double equal to 1 colon, let's say we want to throw 0 division exception, so I will say divide by 0, and then I will say if I double equal to 3, and I will say raise value error saying this is invalid value, right? And then I will define multiple except block saying one with the value error, right? Another I will define with the except 0 division error, as E. I will say print E, and then I want to define, let's say, type error, and I will simply say print E, Now let's go ahead and run this. So what will happen is that on line number 20, whenever the value of I will become 1, it will say I divided by 0, and that's not possible. So it will throw an exception saying 0 division error, and it will print that exception, and then it will run successfully for I equal to 2. And then when the value becomes 3, then it will raise the error manually, raise an exception manually saying this is invalid value. So that will again come by on line number 24, right? And here we don't have any type error, so type error exception will not be raised. So let's go ahead and run this. So as you can see, here we have the division by 0 exception followed by this is invalid value. So let me also print I, so that we don't miss the value of I as 2, right? So let's run again. So while the value was 1, it returned division by 0. While the value was 2, it ran successfully. And while the value of I was 3, it raised an exception saying this is invalid value, right? So this is how you can define single try block with multiple except block, right? So now moving along. So now for example, you might want to run certain block of code if there is no exception, right? So it means the try block executed successfully, then only you want to run something. So at that point of time, you can use else statement with try except, right? So let me comment this. Let's use this, right? So here I will say, let's say 10 divided by 10. So this is going to run successfully. It's not going to throw an exception. Now if it runs successfully, then I want to say print it ran successfully, right? But if there is an exception or if there is an error within try block, then it should raise an exception. Then it should not print, or it should not go to line number 13, right? So let's have a look. Let's run this. So as you can see, 10 divided by 10, that is 1. And then it ran the else block, that is it ran successfully, right? Now what it means is that whenever the try block is successful, else part will get executed, right? Now if I go ahead and change this 10 by 10 to 10 by 0, then it's going to raise an exception, right? So it means our else part should not be executed. So let's run this. So as you can see, it only returned the exception, that is division by 0, and it didn't ran line number 14, or it didn't went to the line number 13, right? So this is how you can use else block when you want to execute something when the try block is successful, right? So that's basically try except else part. Now let's go to the one last thing, that is finally block, right? So finally block is again optional, and here else block is also optional, right? So finally block will run no matter what, right? So it will be executed if the try block runs successfully or it has an exception, right? So for example, you want to run something, right? Whether the try block ran successfully or whether there is an exception, then also this statement should get executed either way, right? So all you have to change is that replace else with finally, right? Now here, this is going to be executed mandatory, right? Compulsorily this is going to get executed. So let's have a look. So right now on line number 10, it's going to throw an exception, then it will go ahead and execute line number 12, and then it will execute line number 14, right? So let's run this. So as you can see, it returned division by 0 exception, then it printed line number 14, that is it ran successfully. Now for example, if I change this line number 10 to 10 divided by 10, and if I run this again, it returned 1.0. It means the try block ran successfully, there is no exception, but again the finally block got executed, right? It ran successfully, right? So no matter what, finally block is going to get executed, right? as compared to else part. Within else part, when the try block is successful, then only the else block will get executed. If there is an exception, else part is not going to run the block of code, right? So that's between else and finally block. So that's all I wanted to cover in terms of the exception handling, right? And as usual, if you want me to do tutorial on any use case or service, then please leave them below and I will try my best to come up with the tutorial as soon as possible. And if you have any queries or comments, then again please leave them below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and see you next time.